My precious family, never forget true greatness comes from honoring the women who make us who we are. Without their love, this world has no meaning, no beauty, no soul. Cherish them, protect them, and hold them like the rarest treasure. My channel is dying because many of you don't get notifications. Please, just like and comment. It takes only 2 seconds but gives me strength and keeps this family alive. Every story I bring is written with love and respect for you. Stay with me until the end, because your trust is my hope and your loyalty is my power. If your heart is true, right, present. If your love is real, right. I am with Mr. Peter. Some fairy tales begin with glass slippers and pumpkin carriages, but Barbara Kelly's started with champagne bubbles, catching the light like diamonds, and a stranger's eyes that promised forever. The Metropolitan Museum's autumn gala buzzed with Atlanta's elite, but she only noticed him, tall, commanding, with the kind of smile that made her forget she was there for work, not pleasure. You're staring at the Monet like it holds the secrets of the universe, came a voice behind her, rich and warm as aged bourbon. Barbara turned, her emerald silk dress rustling, to find the most beautiful man she'd ever seen. Not beautiful in a pretty way, but in the way mountains are beautiful, solid, breathtaking, impossible to ignore. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit tailored to perfection, but it was his eyes that caught her. Deep brown, almost black, with laugh lines that spoke of joy and intelligence that sparked recognition in her soul. "Maybe it does," she replied, tilting her head with practiced confidence. Years of climbing corporate ladders as one of the few black women in Atlanta's predominantly white corporate world had taught her never to show weakness, even when her heart hammered like hummingbird wings. Art has a way of revealing truths we're not ready to see. Weston Bennett, he said, extending his hand. The name meant nothing to her then, though it would soon mean everything. Barbara Kelly. His handshake lingered, warm and sure, sending electricity up her arm that she tried desperately to ignore. The Barbara Kelly who revolutionized digital marketing for Morrison and Associates, the one who convinced 60-year-old CEOs to embrace social media. His smile widened, genuine admiration lighting his features. She blinked, surprised. "You know my work?" "Know it? I've been trying to hire you for 2 years. Your Morrison campaign increased their revenue by 40%. That's not luck, that's genius." For the next 3 hours they talked. Not the shallow networking chatter that filled these events, but real conversation that flowed like fine wine. He was brilliant, building tech empires while she'd been conquering marketing mountains. He made her laugh until her cheeks ached, challenged her ideas without diminishing them, and looked at her like she was the only woman in a room full of Atlanta's most beautiful socialites. "Would you like to see something incredible?" he asked as the evening wound down. She should have said no. Should have gone home to her perfectly ordered apartment, her perfectly planned life. Instead, she found herself in his Aston Martin, racing through Atlanta's glittering streets toward the unknown. He took her to his private rooftop garden atop the Bennett Tower, the city sprawling below them like scattered jewels. The space was magical, fairy lights strung between olive trees, comfortable seating arranged around fire pits, the distant sounds of the city creating a symphony of belonging. "This is where I come to think," he said, pouring wine from a bottle that probably cost more than her monthly salary. "Where I come to remember what matters." "And what matters?" she asked, accepting the glass, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Connection, purpose, beauty that takes your breath away." He looked at her as he said it, his meaning unmistakable. They talked until sunrise painted the sky pink and gold, sharing dreams and fears and stories that revealed their souls. She told him about growing up in Atlanta's historic West End, about her father who worked 3 jobs to put her through college, about her fierce determination to prove she belonged in boardrooms full of men who thought her success was luck rather than brilliance. He shared his own struggles, the weight of family expectations, the loneliness of wealth, the pressure to be perfect in a world that watched his every move. "I've never met anyone like you," he whispered as dawn broke over the city, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with heartbreaking tenderness. "That's a dangerous thing to say to a woman," she replied, but she leaned into his touch, her careful walls crumbling. "I mean it. You're brilliant and beautiful and real in a way that makes everything else seem like shadows." The first kiss was soft, tentative, a question answered with breathless certainty. The second was deeper, hungrier, full of promise and possibility that made her forget every reason this was complicated. 3 months later, he proposed on his yacht during a sunset cruise, dropping to one knee as dolphins played in their wake. The ring was stunning, a flawless solitaire that caught the light like captured starfire, but it was his words that undid her. "Barbara Kelly, you've shown me what it means to be truly alive. Will you marry me and let me spend forever trying to deserve you?" She said yes through tears of pure joy. Knowing she was saying yes to more than marriage, she was saying yes to a life she'd never dared dream possible. Their wedding 6 months later was everything fairy tales promised. The venue, a restored plantation house with gardens that looked like they'd been painted by angels, took her breath away. Her dress, custom designed by Vera Wang, made her feel like a princess. But it was Weston's face when she walked down the aisle that made it perfect. He looked at her like she was magic made manifest. Like every prayer he'd ever whispered had been answered. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he whispered when she reached him, his voice thick with emotion. The ceremony was intimate despite its grandeur, 200 of their closest friends and family witnessing vows that felt carved from their hearts. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Weston's kiss was gentle but claiming, a promise sealed with tenderness and fire. The reception was a dream woven from candlelight and laughter. They danced to John Legend crooning "All of Me," lost in each other's eyes while their guests faded into background music. Barbara had never felt so cherished, so celebrated, so perfectly where she belonged. But even in paradise, shadows lurked at the edges. During the champagne toasts, she noticed the glances, whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, smiles that seemed practiced rather than genuine. The Bennett family was polite but distant, their warmth reserved for Weston, while she received measured courtesy that felt careful rather than welcoming. The most chilling moment came during the reception's height, when she overheard Deborah Bennett, elegant, steel-spined, with silver hair that never dared move out of place, murmuring to the family matriarch near the rose garden. "She's lovely, certainly, and Weston is clearly besotted." Deborah's cultured voice carried on the evening breeze. "But will she understand what being a Bennett requires? The expectations, the responsibilities, the adjustments necessary when one marries into our kind of family." Barbara's champagne suddenly tasted bitter. The fairy tale wobbled on its foundation as she realized marrying into paradise came with conditions she'd never considered, conditions that felt heavier, because she knew she'd always be seen as the outsider who didn't quite fit their carefully curated image of what a Bennett wife should look like. Later that night, alone in their honeymoon suite while Weston took a business call, Barbara stared at her reflection in the antique mirror. Her wedding dress hung nearby like a beautiful ghost, and she wondered if she'd just promised to become one too. The next morning, as they prepared to leave for their honeymoon in Tuscany, Deborah appeared at their suite door with coffee service and a smile that never reached her eyes. "Welcome to the family, darling," she said, settling gracefully into the sitting area like a queen claiming her throne. "Now that the festivities are over, we need to discuss your new role and what being a Bennett wife truly means." Chapter 2. The Velvet Prison. The honeymoon in Tuscany had been pure magic, making love in ancient villas while morning light painted golden frescoes across their entwined bodies, sharing bottles of Chianti under stars that seemed close enough to pluck. Discovering that desire could be both gentle and consuming, Barbara returned to Atlanta glowing with happiness, ready to build her new life as Mrs. Weston Bennett. Reality struck like ice water 6 months later during their first formal family dinner at the Bennett estate. The mansion itself was intimidating, all marble columns and priceless art, rooms that whispered of old money and older expectations. Barbara chose her outfit carefully, an emerald shift dress that complemented her rich brown skin, designer heels that made her legs look endless, jewelry that struck the perfect balance between elegant and understated. She thought she looked perfect until Deborah's appraising gaze traveled from her head to her toes with surgical precision. "How vibrant," Deborah commented, her smile sharp as crystal. "Though perhaps something more subdued would be appropriate for family gatherings. We tend toward classic restraint." The criticism landed like a slap, but Barbara maintained her composure. She'd survived worse in corporate boardrooms filled with men who questioned whether she belonged there. Dinner was an exercise in subtle warfare. The table was set with china so delicate it seemed to whisper threats of destruction, crystal that caught the chandelier light like captured rainbows, silverware that probably cost more than most people's cars. Barbara navigated the elaborate place setting flawlessly. Her mother had insisted on etiquette lessons years ago, but felt Deborah watching her every move like a hawk studying prey. "So, Barbara," said Evangeline Ross, Weston's elegant cousin-in-law, "are you still working at Morrison & Associates?" "Actually, I'm considering some exciting new opportunities," Barbara replied, her voice bright with enthusiasm. "There's talk of a partnership track, and I've been approached by several firms about heading their digital divisions." The silence that followed felt pregnant with disapproval. "How ambitious," Deborah observed, dabbing her lips with her napkin, "though I imagine marriage changes one's priorities considerably. A Bennett wife has such important responsibilities to family and community, Mom," Weston warned gently, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm simply saying that when one marries into a family like ours, certain sacrifices become necessary," Deborah continued smoothly. "Take Evangeline here. She was quite the art dealer before marrying Charles, but she found true fulfillment in supporting family endeavors." Barbara looked at Evangeline, who smiled with practiced grace while something died behind her eyes. "Of course, every woman must find her own path," Deborah added with false magnanimity. "Though I do hope you'll consider how your choices reflect on the Bennett name." The conversation moved on, but the message was clear: conform or be consumed. Later, as Barbara recounted an amusing story about her latest client campaign, her animated gestures and infectious laughter filling the formal dining room with warmth, Deborah's correction came swift and surgical. "Grace is in restraint, dear. Indoor voices, please." The words were said with a smile, but they cut deep. Barbara felt herself shrinking, her natural exuberance dimming under Deborah's disapproving gaze. That night, in their marble bathroom that looked like something from a luxury hotel, Barbara confronted Weston about his mother's behavior. "She doesn't like me," she said, removing her earrings with hands that trembled slightly. Weston appeared behind her in the mirror, his strong hand settling on her shoulders. Even after 6 months of marriage, his touch still sent shivers through her. He was beautiful in the bathroom's soft lighting, hair mussed from running his fingers through it, shirt unbuttoned to reveal the chest she loved to rest her head against. "That's not true," he said, but his eyes in the mirror couldn't quite meet hers. "She's protective, cautious. She raised me alone after Dad died when I was 12. The family business, the social obligations, the constant scrutiny, it nearly broke her. She just wants to make sure you're prepared for what being a Bennett means." "And what does it mean?" Barbara asked, turning in his arms to face him directly. He pulled her close, his familiar cologne wrapping around her like comfort. "It means being part of something bigger than ourselves. It means responsibility, tradition, excellence. It means being worthy of the name. And if I'm not worthy enough for her?" The question came out smaller than she intended. "You are," he insisted, framing her face with his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "You're brilliant and beautiful and perfect. She just needs time to see what I see. He kissed her then, deep and claiming, and she let herself believe his promises. Later, as they made love with desperate passion, she tried to forget the feeling that she was disappearing into someone else's expectations. The next morning brought coffee and fresh flowers to their breakfast table, along with an elegantly scripted note from Deborah. "Darling Barbara, I hope you'll join me for lunch tomorrow to discuss your involvement in the Children's Hospital Gala. The committee is eager to meet you. XOXO, Mother Bennett." Barbara stared at the note, recognizing both an olive branch and a leash. "It's a good sign," Weston said, reading over her shoulder as he buttoned his shirt for work. "She's including you in family traditions." But Barbara felt the velvet prison doors closing, soft and beautiful and utterly inescapable. The lunch was everything Barbara expected, a five-star restaurant filled with Atlanta's social elite, conversation that danced around important topics without ever addressing them directly, and subtle lessons in what was expected of a Bennett wife. The other women were lovely, perfectly groomed, and spoke in measured tones about charity work and social obligations that seemed to fill every hour of their carefully orchestrated lives. "We're so excited to have fresh energy on the committee," gushed Priscilla Hamilton Webb, a society matron whose husband owned half of downtown Atlanta. "Someone with your marketing background could revolutionize our fundraising approach." Barbara felt a spark of genuine interest. "I'd love to help. I have some ideas about digital campaigns that could really expand your donor base." The women exchanged glances that made Barbara's excitement wither. "How innovative," Deborah said smoothly, "though we must be careful not to alienate our traditional supporters. The gala has raised millions through time-tested methods. The message was clear: your ideas aren't welcome here." As the weeks passed, Barbara felt herself being molded into an acceptable shape. Deborah's corrections were constant, but delivered with such elegance they felt almost like gifts. Perhaps pearls instead of that bold necklace. "Darling, the committee prefers handwritten notes, so much more personal than email. I've taken the liberty of recommending you to my personal shopper. She has such refined taste." Barbara's vibrant wardrobe gradually gave way to neutral tones and conservative cuts. Her animated storytelling became measured conversation. Her bold ideas were politely redirected into acceptable channels. Weston noticed the changes, but seemed relieved rather than concerned. "You're fitting in beautifully," he said one evening, as she prepared for another charity function in a beige dress that felt like a costume. "Mom says the other wives adore you." Barbara smiled and nodded, but inside she felt herself disappearing, replaced by someone polite and pleasant and perfectly forgettable. The moment of reckoning came 2 weeks later, when Deborah appeared at their door unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, her smile bright as winter sunshine. "Darling, I have the most wonderful news. The family has decided you're ready for your first real test, hosting Christmas dinner for the entire Bennett clan. 35 family members, all expecting the holiday magic our family is known for." Her eyes glittered with anticipation. "It's a tremendous honor, really. A chance to show everyone how perfectly you fit into our traditions." Chapter 3. The Christmas Ordeal. Barbara stared at the calendar on her kitchen wall as if it held the secrets to surviving Christmas, with 35 Bennett family members descending like elegant vultures expecting perfection. 6 weeks stretched ahead of her like an obstacle course designed by someone who knew exactly where her weaknesses lay. "I can do this," she whispered to her reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator, though her voice sounded uncertain even to her own ears. The planning began immediately. Deborah arrived each morning at precisely 9 o'clock with fresh demands disguised as helpful suggestions. The menu required 3 complete revisions because Uncle Theodore has developed a sensitivity to garlic, and the Ashworth cousins are trying that dreadful gluten-free nonsense. The flower arrangements needed to match the ones from Christmas, 1987. When Weston's father was still alive, such a magical year. We must honor his memory. Barbara threw herself into the preparations with the same determination that had built her career. She researched Bennett family traditions until her eyes burned, studied photographs of previous Christmas celebrations until she could recite the table settings from memory, and practiced recipes until her hands moved with mechanical precision. But nothing seemed good enough for Deborah's exacting standards. The dining room chairs need recovering in cream silk. The burgundy looks tired, Deborah announced 3 weeks before Christmas, ignoring the fact that Barbara had already approved different fabric. And we'll need place cards in calligraphy, not printing. Mrs. Ashworth always notices such details. Barbara bit back her frustration and called the designer, the florist, the caterer she'd hired to help with appetizers, only to be told by Deborah that hiring help was impersonal and not in keeping with family tradition. A true Bennett wife creates magic with her own hands, Deborah explained while examining Barbara's practice table setting through reading glasses that made her look like an elegant hawk. It's about love, darling. Anyone can hire professionals. So Barbara cancelled the caterer, donated the fabric she'd chosen, and started over with cream silk that cost 3 times as much and would show every imperfection. Work became impossible. Her assistant fielded increasingly urgent calls, while Barbara rushed between china shops and specialty grocery stores. She lost the Patterson account when she missed their crucial presentation, too exhausted from addressing invitations in perfect calligraphy to function properly in the boardroom that had once been her kingdom. "It's just one Christmas," Weston assured her when she confessed her fears about her career suffering. He was working late again, his laptop glowing in their darkened bedroom, while she lay beside him feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her single life. "Next year will be easier. You're learning, growing into the role." But Barbara wondered if she was growing or simply disappearing into someone else's expectations. 2 weeks before Christmas, the guest list expanded again. Deborah called at 7 in the morning. She'd forgotten to mention that the Whitmore cousins would be in town, and wouldn't it be lovely to include them? That was 8 more people, requiring a complete recalculation of everything from food quantities to seating arrangements. Barbara's hand shook as she hung up the phone. The dining room table, already extended to its maximum capacity, would need another extension. The menu, already complex enough to challenge a professional chef, would need to be increased again. "I can't do this," she whispered to her sister Jasmine during a late-night phone call, her voice breaking with exhaustion. "Then don't," Jasmine replied simply. "Tell them it's too much. Any reasonable person would understand." But Barbara had seen what happened to wives who couldn't meet Deborah's standards. Evangeline Ross had hosted one disastrous Easter where the souffle fell, and she'd been relegated to bringing side dishes ever since. Serafina Cole had served wine that Deborah deemed pedestrian, and 3 years later was still trying to redeem herself through increasingly elaborate contributions to family gatherings. The week before Christmas arrived like a hurricane. Barbara's to-do list covered 3 pages of legal paper. Her kitchen looked like a war zone, and she'd lost 8 pounds from stress and forgotten meals. Her beautiful hands were raw from endless prep work, her eyes hollowed from sleepless nights spent crafting perfect decorations that would be scrutinized and judged. Weston tried to help when his schedule allowed, but his efforts were clumsy and well-meaning rather than useful. He could negotiate billion-dollar deals, but couldn't fold napkins into the swan shapes that Deborah required. His attempts at conversation became increasingly strained as he watched his wife transform into someone he barely recognized. "Maybe we should simplify things," he suggested gently, after finding her crying over a batch of dinner rolls that hadn't risen properly at 2 in the morning. "Your mother doesn't believe in simple," Barbara replied, wiping her tears with flour-covered hands. She believes in proving worthiness through suffering disguised as tradition. The night before Christmas Eve, Barbara sat in her perfectly decorated living room, every surface gleaming, every ornament positioned with museum-quality precision, every detail approved by Deborah after 3 separate inspections, and felt absolutely empty. The house looked like something from a magazine spread, but it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Christmas Eve arrived grey and cold, matching Barbara's mood. She rose at 5 in the morning to begin the final preparations, her body moving through the familiar routines, while her mind felt detached from the elegant woman in the mirror who bore her face, but not her spirit. The guests began arriving at 6, bringing the sounds of laughter and conversation that should have filled her with joy. Instead, Barbara felt like an actress in a play she'd never auditioned for, playing a role that required her to smile and serve and disappear into the background of her own life. Barbara, darling. Deborah swept into the kitchen where Barbara was putting finishing touches on appetizers that looked like small works of art. Everything looks absolutely divine. You've truly outdone yourself. The praise should have felt like victory, but it tasted like ash. Barbara smiled and accepted the compliments from family members who complimented her efforts while looking through her as if she were a beautifully appointed piece of furniture, invisible help rather than family. Dinner was a masterpiece of timing and presentation. 7 courses emerged from her kitchen in perfect sequence, each dish crafted with the attention to detail of a master chef. The table settings were flawless, the conversation flowed like wine, and the evening unfolded exactly as Deborah had orchestrated. But as Barbara served each course, cleared each plate, and managed every detail while the family celebrated, she felt herself becoming more invisible with each passing hour. They complimented the food to Weston, praised the decorations to Deborah, and treated her like hired help who happened to share the host's last name. At midnight, long after the last guest had departed with effusive thanks for such a wonderful evening, Barbara stood alone in her destroyed kitchen. Mountains of dishes waited to be washed, surfaces needed to be cleaned, and the evidence of her Christmas miracle needed to be erased before morning. Her hands were raw and bleeding slightly from the constant work. Her back ached from hours of standing, and her feet felt like they might never recover from her elegant heels. But it was her heart that hurt most, empty and aching, with the realization that she'd achieved perfection at the cost of her own existence. Weston found her there at 2 in the morning, scrubbing crystal wine glasses with tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "Hey," he said softly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "You were incredible tonight." Everyone couldn't stop talking about how amazing everything was. They talked about the food, the decorations, the ambiance, Barbara whispered without turning around. "Nobody talked about me." "That's not true," he protested. But his voice lacked conviction. "I worked for 6 weeks to become invisible in my own home," she continued, her words barely audible over the running water. "I disappeared completely, and nobody even noticed I was gone." Weston tightened his embrace, pressing his face into her hair that still smelled like turkey and exhaustion despite her efforts to remain perfectly groomed throughout the evening. "You're tired," he said finally. "Everything will look better in the morning. Mom said you've earned her respect. That's huge, Barbara. You've proven yourself." But as Barbara continued washing dishes in the early morning silence, she wondered what she'd proven except her willingness to sacrifice herself on the altar of someone else's approval. The next morning brought a beautiful arrangement of white roses with a note in Deborah's perfect script. "Dearest Barbara, thank you for such a magical Christmas. You've shown everyone what a true Bennett wife can accomplish. With love and admiration, Mother Bennett." Barbara stared at the note for a long time, then carefully placed it in the kitchen drawer, where she kept recipes she'd never use again. Outside her window, Atlanta sparkled with post-Christmas serenity, but inside her perfect house, Barbara felt the first cracks forming in the foundation of her carefully constructed new life. That afternoon, as she finally sat down to eat her first real meal in days, her phone rang. Evangeline Rossi's voice was soft and careful, like someone speaking in a library. "Barbara, darling, I hope you're recovering from your triumph last night. I wanted to warn you about something. Deborah's already planning Easter, and she's mentioned that you've shown such promise with formal entertaining. I thought you should know that she's considering letting you handle the spring garden party, too." Chapter 4. The Wives. Warning: the exclusive Primrose Day Spa existed in a realm where silence was golden and imperfection was banished through rituals involving cucumber-infused water and treatments. With names like Renewal Radiance, Barbara had been summoned, though Evangeline Ross had called it an invitation to join the Bennett wives for their monthly spa retreat, a tradition as sacred and mandatory as Sunday service. She'd almost declined, claiming work obligations, but caught herself before the words escaped. Her career was already suffering from the constant family commitments that seemed to multiply like elegant weeds. Missing this gathering would only provide Deborah with more evidence that she wasn't fully committed to family integration. The spa's reception area whispered wealth through hand-woven Persian rugs, fresh orchid arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and staff members who spoke in voices so soft they seemed to float on perfumed air. Barbara checked in wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and tailored slacks, an outfit that 6 months ago would have felt natural but now felt like a costume she wore to play the role of acceptable Bennett wife. "Barbara, there you are, darling." Evangeline Ross glided toward her, looking ethereal in flowing white linen that made her appear almost ghost-like against the spa's neutral backdrop. Her smile was warm, but her eyes held something deeper, recognition perhaps, or warning. Serafina Cole emerged from the changing area like a vision from a high-end magazine spread. Once a successful architect who designed award-winning buildings across the Southeast, she now spent her days planning charity luncheons and speaking in the measured cadence that all Bennett wives eventually adopted. Her handshake was firm but brief, as if too much contact might be contagious. "We're so glad you could join us," Serafina said, her voice holding the precise diction of someone who'd learned to edit herself. "Thursday spa days are sacred time. No husbands, no obligations, just sisterhood and restoration." Celeste Bennett Ward completed their quartet, arriving in a flutter of apologies about traffic and parking. At 28, she was closest to Barbara's age, but carried herself with the careful composure of someone much older. Her law degree from Columbia gathered dust while she organized book clubs and historical society meetings, her sharp intellect channeled into safe, approved pursuits. "I'm so excited you're here," Celeste whispered as they were led to the relaxation lounge. "It gets lonely being the only one under 40 in this family sometimes." The spa experience began with champagne and organic fruit, in a room designed to induce serenity through expensive minimalism. Soft music played at frequencies scientifically proven to lower blood pressure, while aromatherapy scents promised to realign chakras and restore inner peace. Barbara sipped her champagne and tried to shake the feeling that she was attending a very elegant wake. "So tell us," Evangeline said, settling gracefully into her plush chair, "how are you finding married life? The adjustment can be significant." "It's wonderful," Barbara replied automatically, the words feeling hollow in her mouth. "Weston is amazing, and his family has been very welcoming." The three women exchanged glances that spoke volumes in a language Barbara was still learning to decode. "Of course they have," Serafina agreed smoothly. "The Bennetts are masters of making one feel included while simultaneously establishing expectations." "Christmas was beautiful," Celeste added with enthusiasm that seemed forced. Deborah raved about your hosting skills. She said you showed real promise for understanding family standards. It was exhausting, Barbara confessed before she could stop herself, then immediately regretted the admission. The first formal dinner always is, Evangeline said gently. I remember my debut Christmas. I was so terrified I barely slept for weeks. But it gets easier once you understand the rules. What rules? Barbara asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. The three women looked at each other again, some silent communication passing between them like smoke. Perhaps we should start with our treatments, Serafina suggested diplomatically. These conversations are better suited to private spaces. The next 2 hours passed in a haze of luxury treatments that felt more like preparing her for sacrifice than renewal. Barbara's massage was performed by hands that seemed to recognize the tension she carried, kneading knots from muscles that had been clenched for months. Her facial promised to restore her natural glow, though she wondered if that glow had been permanently dimmed by constant stress, but it was. During the seaweed wrap, lying in a darkened room, cocooned in treatments that smelled like the ocean, that Evangeline finally spoke the truths that had been dancing. Around their conversation all day, I used to own 3 art galleries, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the spa's ambient music. Contemporary pieces mostly, some emerging artists who've gone on to international recognition. I discovered talent, nurtured careers, created beauty that lasted beyond dinner parties and charity functions. Barbara turned her head slightly, seeing Evangeline's profile in the dim light. Even relaxed, she looked like a Renaissance painting of melancholy. What happened? Barbara asked, though she suspected she already knew. I got married, Evangeline replied simply. Charles needed a wife who could focus entirely on family obligations. The galleries were too time-consuming, too unpredictable. What if an opening conflicted with a Bennett family function? What if I was too exhausted from managing businesses to hostess properly? So you gave them up? I sold them to focus on more appropriate pursuits. Deborah helped me understand that a Bennett wife's role is supporting her husband's success, not pursuing her own ambitions. My galleries were selfish indulgences that took away from my true purpose. The words were said without emotion, as if Evangeline had practiced them until they no longer held the power to wound. I miss it every day, she added in a whisper so soft Barbara almost didn't hear it. In the next room, Serafina's voice drifted through the thin walls as she spoke to her masseuse about the buildings she used to design, innovative structures that had won awards and changed city skylines. Now her creativity was channeled into planning seating arrangements and coordinating color schemes for events that would be forgotten within weeks. The architecture was just too demanding. Serafina's voice carried the same rehearsed quality as Evangeline's. Family comes first, and marriage requires compromise. I found more fulfillment in supporting community causes than in selfish career pursuits. Later, in the steam room where humidity made honesty feel safer, Celeste spoke about her law practice with the wistful tone of someone discussing a deceased loved one. I specialized in environmental law, she said, her words floating in the thick air like confessions. Corporate accountability, pollution cases, fighting for communities that couldn't fight for themselves. I thought I could change the world. Why did you stop? Barbara asked, though she was beginning to see the pattern. Deborah convinced me there were conflicts of interest. What if I took a case against a company that did business with Bennett Enterprises? What if my work reflected poorly on the family? Environmental law is so confrontational. It wasn't suitable for someone in my position, but surely James supported your career. Celeste was quiet for a long moment, steam swirling around her like ghosts of abandoned dreams. He said he married me for my intelligence and passion, she finally replied. But he also said that real intelligence meant knowing when to step back. That true passion was found in supporting family legacy, not pursuing individual glory. The three women's stories wove together like a cautionary tale told in expensive whispers. Each had been accomplished, driven, successful in their own right before marriage transformed them into beautiful accessories to other people's lives. "The first year is the hardest," Evangeline said as they prepared to leave, her voice carrying the wisdom of hard experience. "You'll resist at first, fight to maintain your independence, your career, your sense of self, but gradually you'll find it's easier to comply than to constantly battle. The requests start small," Serafina added, touching up her lipstick with hands that once drew blueprints for buildings that would outlast them all. "Skip one client meeting for a family lunch. Leave early from work for a charity event. Cancel a business trip because it conflicts with a social obligation. Before you know it, your world shrinks to fit their expectations," Celeste concluded, her voice hollow with recognition. "And you convince yourself it's what you wanted all along because the alternative, admitting you've lost yourself completely, is too painful to acknowledge." Barbara listened to their warnings with growing horror, recognizing herself in their stories like looking into a funhouse mirror that showed possible futures instead of distorted reflections. "But surely it's not that black and white," she protested weakly. "Marriage requires compromise, but it doesn't have to mean losing yourself completely, doesn't it?" Evangeline asked softly. "Look at us, Barbara. Really look at us. Do you see any trace of the women we used to be?" Barbara studied their faces, still beautiful, still elegant, still poised and perfect. But behind their carefully applied makeup and practiced smiles, she saw something that chilled her to the bone: resignation. These were women who had been so gradually diminished that they'd forgotten they'd ever been whole. As they prepared to leave the spa, skin glowing from treatments that promised renewal but delivered only temporary polish, Evangeline placed a gentle hand on Barbara's arm. "There's still time," she whispered, her words carrying the urgency of a final warning. "You're still fighting, still questioning. That's something we'd all forgotten how to do by this point in our marriages." "What are you saying?" Barbara asked, though her heart was already racing with implications. "I'm saying that perhaps not all of us have to disappear," Evangeline replied, her eyes meeting Barbara's with something that might have been hope or might have been desperate wishful thinking. "Perhaps one of us can find a way to remain whole." That evening, Barbara sat in her perfect living room, staring at the business cards still displayed in her silver card holder, evidence of the professional identity she'd worked years to build. Each card represented connections, opportunities, dreams that felt increasingly distant with each family obligation that consumed her time and energy. Her phone buzzed with a text from Weston. "Working late again. Don't wait up. Love you." But as Barbara climbed the stairs to their empty bedroom, she wondered if love was supposed to feel like slowly drowning in silk and silver, beautiful and suffocating all at once. The next morning, Deborah called before Barbara had finished her first cup of coffee, her voice bright with excitement that made Barbara's stomach clench with dread. "Darling, I have the most wonderful news about Thanksgiving that's going to be absolutely perfect for showcasing your growing skills as a hostess." Chapter 5. The Impossible Task. The morning sun, streaming through her kitchen windows, should have felt like a blessing, but Barbara could only stare at the golden light pooling on her marble countertops, while Deborah's voice continued its relentless cheerfulness through the phone. Each word fell like a stone into the quiet sanctuary of her morning routine, shattering the peaceful moment she'd been savoring with her coffee and the memory of who she used to be. The Bennet family patriarch, Weston's beloved grandfather Edmund, is turning 80 this November. Deborah's voice sparkled with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for announcing lottery winnings or miracle cures. And what better way to honor his legacy than with a Thanksgiving celebration that combines family tradition with milestone birthday recognition. Barbara set down her coffee cup with hands that had begun to tremble slightly. She'd learned to read the subtext in Deborah's announcements, and this one carried the weight of inevitability disguised as opportunity. "It sounds lovely," she managed, her voice steady despite the growing dread in her chest. "Oh, it will be more than lovely. It will be legendary," Deborah continued, her words painting pictures of grandeur that felt more like threats than promises. 42 family members, darling. 3 generations of Bennets gathering to celebrate the man who built our empire from nothing. The cousins from Charleston, the West Coast relatives, even the European contingent are flying in specifically for this occasion. 42 people. Barbara's kitchen, spacious as it was, suddenly felt inadequate. Her dining room, which had seemed palatial when they'd bought the house, now appeared laughably small in her mind's eye. And as one of the few black women who would be in attendance, she felt the familiar weight of representation, knowing every aspect of her performance would be scrutinized not just as a new wife, but as someone who didn't look like the Bennet family's traditional idea of belonging. "Of course, we'll need to rent additional tables and chairs," she said, already calculating logistics while her heart raced with panic. "Oh no, darling." Deborah's laugh tinkled like expensive wind chimes in a threatening breeze. "This is far too important for makeshift arrangements. We'll be hosting at Magnolia Grove." Magnolia Grove, the Bennet family estate where Weston had grown up, a sprawling mansion with formal dining rooms that could accommodate small armies and kitchens, designed for entertaining on a scale that would challenge professional caterers. "I see," Barbara said carefully. "So you'll be hosting, and I'll help with—" "No, no, no," Deborah interrupted with the patient tone usually reserved for correcting confused children. "This is your opportunity to truly prove yourself as a Bennet wife. The hosting responsibilities fall to you entirely. I'll be far too busy managing the guest accommodations and coordinating travel arrangements for the out-of-town family members." The words hit Barbara like a physical blow. She was quiet for so long that Deborah's voice took on a note of concern. "Barbara? Are you there, darling?" "I'm here," she whispered, her mind reeling with the impossibility of what was being asked. "But Deborah, 42 people for Thanksgiving dinner. That's not just cooking, that's practically catering a small wedding." "Exactly." Deborah's enthusiasm ratcheted up another notch. "What a wonderful way to demonstrate your capabilities. Think of it as your formal debut as a Bennet hostess. Everyone will finally see what Weston saw in you, that special something that makes you worthy of our family name." The manipulation was so elegant, so perfectly crafted, that Barbara almost admired its artistry. Refuse, and she'd be admitting she wasn't capable of Bennet-level entertaining. Accept, and she'd be signing up for what amounted to professional-level event management with no assistance and impossibly high stakes. All while knowing that as the only black woman in the family, every mistake would be magnified, every imperfection seen as proof that she didn't belong. "But surely we could hire some help," Barbara suggested weakly. "Professional servers, maybe a catering assistant." "Oh, my dear, absolutely not." Deborah's voice carried the kind of horrified shock usually reserved for suggestions of public nudity or tax evasion. "This is a family celebration, not some corporate event. The love, the personal touch, the intimate atmosphere, these things can only come from family hands. Hired help would make it impersonal, commercial. Edmund deserves better than that." Barbara felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, options disappearing like morning mist under the harsh sun of Bennet family expectations. "I understand," she said finally, "though understanding and accepting were two very different things." "I knew you would," Deborah purred with satisfaction. "This is your moment to shine, darling. Your chance to show everyone that you truly belong in this family. I have complete faith in your abilities." After hanging up, Barbara sat in her kitchen for a long time, staring at her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold during the conversation. The kitchen that had once felt like her sanctuary now seemed like a stage where she was expected to perform miracles. 42 people for Thanksgiving dinner. Not just any dinner, but one that would be judged against decades of Bennett family celebrations, measured against the standards of a woman who treated hospitality like a competitive sport. Every dish would be scrutinized, every detail evaluated, every moment assessed for worthiness. When Weston arrived home that evening, she was still sitting at the kitchen island, surrounded by cookbooks and planning notebooks. Her laptop open to catering websites and grocery delivery services. "Hey, beautiful," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head while loosening his tie. He looked exhausted. The hostile takeover he'd been managing had consumed his days and invaded his nights, turning him into a stranger who lived in their house but existed in boardrooms and conference calls. "What's all this?" "Your mother called," Barbara said without looking up from the timeline she'd been sketching. "Thanksgiving is going to be at Magnolia Grove this year, for 42 people, and I'm handling all the cooking and hosting." Weston was quiet for a long moment, his hand stilling on her shoulder. 42 people? He repeated slowly. "Your grandfather's 80th birthday celebration. The entire extended family is coming." Barbara's voice was carefully neutral, but Weston knew her well enough to hear the strain underneath. "That's a lot," he admitted, settling onto the stool beside her. "But you don't have to do it alone. We'll hire caterers, professional staff." "Your mother specifically said no hired help," Barbara interrupted. "Family hands only. Personal touch, intimate atmosphere." She recited Deborah's words with the precision of someone who'd memorized a script against her will. Weston ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as his signature stress response. "Look, this takeover is killing me right now," he said finally. "If we don't close by Christmas, we could lose everything we've worked for. But after that's done, I promise I'll help however I can." "This is Thanksgiving, Weston, not Christmas. You're talking about helping after it's over." I know, he said, reaching for her hand. His fingers were warm and familiar, wedding ring catching the kitchen light like a promise that felt increasingly hollow. "But you're amazing at this stuff. Remember Christmas?" It was perfect. Mom hasn't stopped talking about how impressed everyone was. Barbara wanted to scream that Christmas had nearly broken her, that she'd spent 6 weeks transforming herself into someone she didn't recognize, that the praise had felt like consolation prizes for successfully erasing her own identity. Instead, she nodded and squeezed his hand. "I just need you to understand how big this is," she said quietly. "I do understand," he insisted, though his eyes were already drifting toward his laptop, where emails multiplied like aggressive weeds. "And I believe in you completely. You're going to blow everyone away." But as Weston disappeared into his study to continue working, Barbara wondered if being blown away was worth the cost of blowing herself apart in the process. The next morning brought a deliverized envelope from Deborah, containing detailed guest lists, dietary restrictions, family preferences, and a suggested menu that read like a molecular gastronomy textbook. Turkey, of course, but not just any turkey. Free-range heritage birds from a specific farm in Virginia, ordered months in advance. 3 different stuffing varieties to accommodate various family traditions. Homemade cranberry sauce using berries from Cape Cod. Sweet potato casserole with pecans from Georgia. Green bean casserole made from scratch, no canned ingredients. Mashed potatoes that required specific varieties of potatoes and imported butter. The dessert list alone filled an entire page. Traditional pumpkin pie, pecan pie, apple crumble, bread pudding, and something called Grandmother Bennett's famous chocolate, torte. A recipe that came with a warning about its complexity and a note that it had never been successfully replicated outside the family. Barbara stared at the menu until the words blurred together, calculating cooking times and oven space, and the impossibility of timing everything perfectly without an army of assistants. Her phone rang, interrupting her spiral into panic. "Barbara, it's Evangeline. I heard about Thanksgiving through the family grapevine. How are you feeling about it?" The genuine concern in Evangeline's voice almost broke Barbara's carefully maintained composure. Terrified, she admitted. It's impossible, isn't it? 42 people, that menu, no professional help. It's designed to be impossible. Yes, Evangeline said simply. It is. Then why is she asking me to do it? Because impossible tasks serve multiple purposes, Evangeline replied, with the weary wisdom of someone who'd survived too many of them. If you somehow succeed, you'll be so exhausted and beaten down that you'll never question family expectations again. If you fail, you'll be so grateful for forgiveness that you'll spend years trying to redeem yourself. And if I refuse, then you'll prove you're not committed enough to family to make necessary sacrifices. And the subtle campaign to convince Weston he married the wrong woman begins in earnest. Barbara closed her eyes, feeling trapped in a maze where every path led to some version of losing herself. There has to be a fourth option, she said desperately. Maybe there is, Evangeline replied thoughtfully, but finding it requires courage that none of us have had so far. That afternoon, Barbara stood in the Magnolia Grove kitchen, a massive space with professional-grade appliances and enough counter space to service a restaurant, and tried to imagine herself orchestrating a Thanksgiving miracle for 42 people. The kitchen was beautiful, intimidating, and utterly lacking in the warmth of home cooking. It felt like a stage where she was expected to perform culinary magic without the benefit of actual magic. As she drove home through Atlanta's autumn afternoon, her phone rang. The caller ID made her stomach clench. Morrison and Associates. Barbara, it's David Morrison. I hate to bother you, but we need to talk about the Patterson Industries presentation. Her former boss's voice carried the kind of careful disappointment that felt worse than outright anger. The presentation she'd missed because of Christmas preparations. The client she'd lost because family obligations had consumed her professional focus. David, I can explain. I'm sure you can, he interrupted gently. But explanations don't rebuild client relationships. Barbara, you're one of our most talented executives, but talent means nothing if you can't deliver consistently. The conversation was brief and devastating. No ultimatum, no dramatic firing. Just a quiet suggestion that perhaps she needed to reassess her priorities and determine whether she was truly committed to her career. That evening, Barbara sat in her car in her own driveway for 20 minutes, unable to face walking into the house where Weston would ask how her day went, and she'd have to pretend everything was fine. Her career was crumbling, her marriage felt like a performance, and she'd committed to an impossible task that would either destroy her or transform her into someone she no longer recognized. Finally, she gathered enough courage to walk inside, where she found Weston on another conference call in his study, his dinner growing cold on the kitchen counter while he fought to save his business empire. That night, lying in bed beside her husband, who was physically present but emotionally absent, Barbara stared at the ceiling and whispered a question into the darkness. When did love start feeling like drowning? The next morning, Deborah called bright and early with additional clarifications about the Thanksgiving menu. Each new requirement feeling like another stone added to the weight Barbara was expected to carry. Oh, and darling, Deborah added just before hanging up, I've taken the liberty of inviting Marcus Whitfield from Southern Living magazine and Patricia Chen from Atlanta Social Register. They're so excited to document this celebration of family tradition. Won't that be wonderful? Chapter 6. The Final Straw. The calendar mocked Barbara from its position on her refrigerator. Each day leading to Thanksgiving, marked with increasingly frantic notes and reminders that read like a war strategy written by someone slowly losing their sanity. 2 weeks remained, and the impossibility of her task had crystallized into something that felt less like a family celebration and more like an elaborate, form of torture designed by someone who understood exactly which pressure points would cause maximum damage. Sleep had become a stranger. Barbara's nights were filled with anxiety dreams where turkeys caught fire, guests arrived to empty tables, and Deborah's disappointed face multiplied into a crowd of judges, finding her wanting in every conceivable way. She'd wake at 3 in the morning with her heart racing, immediately calculating cooking times and oven rotations, wondering if she could somehow rent additional kitchen equipment without violating the family hands-only mandate that had become her prison. The guest list had grown. Again, Deborah's oversight in forgetting cousin. Theodore's new wife meant exactly 42 people now, requiring another place setting and menu adjustment. The addition felt deliberate, another small torture designed to keep Barbara constantly off balance, never quite able to achieve the perfection that seemed perpetually just out of reach. Her laptop screen glowed with 17 different spreadsheets tracking everything from ingredient quantities to serving dish assignments. She'd color-coded cooking schedules, created backup plans for the backup plans, and researched every possible thing that could go wrong with each dish. The preparation consumed her waking hours completely, transforming her into someone she barely recognized, a woman who spoke in lists and lived in constant fear of catastrophic failure. Work had become impossible. Her assistant, Patricia, fielded increasingly urgent calls while Barbara rushed between specialty grocery stores searching for heritage turkey suppliers and imported ingredients that Deborah deemed essential for authentic family recipes. The Hartwell Industries pitch, a campaign that could have secured her partnership track, fell apart when she missed 3 consecutive client meetings. Too exhausted from menu planning to function in professional settings that once energized her. "I'm worried about you," Patricia said during one of Barbara's brief office appearances, her voice carrying the careful concern of someone who'd watched a competent executive transform into a frazzled shadow of her former self. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks, and frankly your work is suffering. The partners are asking questions." Barbara wanted to explain that sleep felt like a luxury she couldn't afford, that her work was suffering because she was drowning in obligations that had nothing to do with her career, but everything to do with proving her worthiness as a wife. Instead, she smiled with practiced brightness and promised to prioritize better, knowing it was a lie they both recognized, but neither acknowledged. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when Barbara stood in Williams, Sonoma, trying to decide between copper serving bowls and silver ones, while her phone rang with the 5th family-related crisis of the day. Serafina calling about Uncle Edmund's new dietary restrictions. Celeste asking about parking arrangements for the out-of-town guests. Deborah wanting confirmation about the centerpiece arrangements she'd forgotten to discuss earlier. Each call was reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a symphony of demands that left Barbara feeling like she was being pecked to death by elegant, well-meaning birds. "I'm sorry," she said to the sales associate who'd been waiting patiently while she juggled phone calls and indecision. "I need a moment to think." But thinking had become dangerous. When she allowed her mind to wander beyond immediate logistics, she found herself confronting truths that felt too large and frightening to acknowledge, like the fact that she'd lost 12 pounds from stress and forgotten meals, that she'd stopped calling her sister Jasmine because explaining her life had become too exhausting, that she'd missed her own doctor's appointment, a routine checkup that had been scheduled for months, because it conflicted with a crucial centerpiece. Consultation with Deborah's florist. Most frightening of all was the realization that she was disappearing, not dramatically but incrementally, like a photograph left too long in sunlight that faded so gradually you didn't notice, until one day you looked and could barely make out the image that used to be there. That evening, Weston found her in their bedroom closet, sitting on the floor surrounded by formal dresses and crying with the quiet desperation of someone who'd run out of tears but couldn't stop the grief from coming. "Hey," he said softly, settling beside her on the plush carpeting.
What's wrong?
The question was so absurd that Barbara almost laughed. What wasn't wrong? Her career was imploding, her health was deteriorating, her sense of self was evaporating, and she was 2 weeks away from either spectacular failure or hollow victory in front of 42 people who would judge her worthiness based on the doneness of her turkey and the smoothness of her gravy. "I can't do this," she whispered, the admission feeling like surrender. "Yes, you can," Weston said immediately, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "You're the strongest person I know. Remember the Morrison campaign? You pulled off a miracle in 3 weeks when everyone said it was impossible." "That was work," Barbara replied, her voice barely audible. "That was something I chose, something I was good at, something that used my actual skills. This is performance art disguised as cooking." "It's family," Weston corrected gently. "It's showing them that you belong, that you understand what matters to us. After this, everything will be easier. You'll have proven yourself, and Mom will back off." Barbara wanted to believe him, but the wife's warnings echoed in her memory. There would always be another test, another opportunity to prove herself, another impossible task disguised as family tradition. Acceptance wasn't the destination. It was the moving target that stayed perpetually out of reach, ensuring constant effort with no promise of arrival. "What if I fail?" she asked, voicing the fear that haunted her sleepless nights. "You won't fail," he said with the confidence of someone who'd never faced the kind of systematic dismantling of identity that she was experiencing. "But even if something went wrong, it's just dinner. Family will understand." But Barbara knew it wasn't just dinner. It was a test of her worthiness, her commitment, her willingness to sacrifice herself on the altar of family expectations. And failure would mean not just disappointment, but exile from a world she'd married into, but never quite been allowed to inhabit as an equal. The next morning brought fresh disasters. The heritage turkey supplier called to inform her that one of her ordered birds had been damaged in transport, leaving her 1 turkey short for 42 people. The florist wanted to confirm centerpiece details that Deborah had apparently changed without informing Barbara. And Patricia Chen from Atlanta Social Register had called to discuss the photography schedule for the family tradition feature she was planning. Barbara stared at her phone, watching the messages multiply like aggressive viruses, each one adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Her hands were shaking, actually trembling, as she scrolled through the demands, requirements, and expectations that had consumed her life so completely that she couldn't remember what it felt like to make a decision based on what she wanted rather than what was expected. At noon, her sister Jasmine called from Denver, her voice bright with the kind of energy that came from living a life of your own choosing. "Hey, stranger," Jasmine said cheerfully. "I haven't heard from you in weeks. How's married life treating you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire Barbara couldn't put out. How was married life treating her? Like a slow-motion car accident where she was simultaneously the passenger and the wreckage, watching herself be destroyed while being powerless to prevent it. "Fine," she lied, her voice sounding hollow even to her own ears. "You sound tired. Are you okay?" And suddenly Barbara wasn't okay. The careful facade she'd maintained for months cracked open like an egg, spilling truth all over her pristine kitchen floor. "I don't know," she whispered. Then louder, "I don't know who I am anymore. Jazz, I don't know what I want, what I like, what I believe in. I only know what's expected of me, and it's never enough." "What do you mean?" Jasmine's voice carried the sharp attention of someone who recognized genuine distress. So, Barbara told her, about Christmas and the wives and the impossible Thanksgiving that loomed like a storm she couldn't outrun. About losing herself in small increments until she'd become a stranger wearing her own face. But love that felt more like elaborate imprisonment than partnership. "When did you become a servant in your own marriage?" Jasmine asked when Barbara finally finished. The question hit like lightning, illuminating truths Barbara had been too afraid to acknowledge. When exactly had her opinion stopped mattering? When had her dreams become obstacles to overcome rather than goals to support? When had proving her worthiness become more important than being happy? "I don't know," Barbara admitted. "It happened so gradually I didn't notice until I was already gone." "Then maybe it's time to come back," Jasmine said simply. After hanging up, Barbara sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd fallen in love with Weston's promises, where she'd planned their future together, where she'd gradually surrendered her identity piece by piece in exchange for acceptance that never quite materialized. The morning light streaming through her windows felt different somehow, less like blessing and more like spotlight illuminating the stage where she performed the role of someone else's idea of the perfect wife. For the first time in months, Barbara allowed herself to ask a dangerous question. What would happen if she simply said no? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating simultaneously. No to the impossible Thanksgiving. No to proving herself worthy of acceptance she should have received unconditionally. No to shrinking herself into someone else's definition of appropriate. But saying no meant disappointing Weston. It meant facing Deborah's disapproval, the family's judgment, the possible end of her marriage to a man she still loved despite everything. It meant choosing herself over everyone else's expectations. And she'd been taught since childhood that such choices were selfish, wrong, unworthy of good women who understood that sacrifice was the highest form of love. That night, as Barbara lay awake beside Weston, who was again working late on his laptop, she stared at the ceiling and made a decision that felt both like salvation and betrayal. At 4 a.m. on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, instead of beginning the prep work she'd scheduled months in advance, Barbara opened her laptop and searched for flights. Not to anywhere specific, just away from expectations and tests and the gradual erasure of self that had become her daily routine. The search results glowed on her screen like escape routes, each destination promising the possibility of remembering who she used to be before she became someone else's project for improvement. Her finger hovered over the purchase button for a flight to Maui. Hawaii, a place she'd dreamed of visiting since college, a destination that existed in her imagination as everything beautiful and free and untouched by other people's requirements. Outside her window, dawn was breaking over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of possibility and transformation. For the first time in months, Barbara smiled, not the practiced smile of a Bennett wife, but the real smile of a woman who'd just remembered she had choices. She clicked purchase and felt something that had been holding its breath for months finally. Exhale, the rebellion had begun. Chapter 7, Breaking Free. The ticket confirmation glowed on her laptop screen like a small miracle. Flight ATL HNL, November 25th, departure 10:15 a.m. Maui called to her through pixels and possibility, promising pristine beaches and turquoise waters, a place where nobody knew she was supposed to be someone other than herself. Barbara moved through her house in the pre-dawn darkness with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd finally found clarity after months of confusion. Each decision felt sharp and clean. Passport from the bedroom safe, credit cards Weston didn't. Monitor, the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother before Bennett expectations began editing her life. She packed light, sundresses in colors Deborah would call vulgar, comfortable sandals instead of designer heels. The worn copy of Eat, Pray, Love she'd hidden behind more appropriate books on her nightstand. The most difficult moment came when she sat down to write the note. Her pen hovered over cream stationery that bore her married initials, BMB, Barbara Michelle Bennett, letters that had once filled her with pride and now felt like a costume she was finally ready to remove. "My darling Weston," she began, then stopped. The endearment felt both true and hollow, encompassing all the love and loss that had brought her to this impossible moment. She started again. "I have gone to remember who I am beneath all the expectations of who I should be. This isn't about not loving you. This is about learning to love myself again. I hope someday you'll understand. I hope someday I'll be able to explain. But right now, I need to breathe." Barbara. She left the note on the kitchen counter beside the turkeys that would never be cooked, the menu that would never be executed, the impossible dream of perfection that had nearly destroyed her in its pursuit. Her wedding ring caught the morning light as she placed it beside the paper, a symbol of promises that had somehow become shackles disguised as jewelry. The Uber driver was a middle-aged woman named Rose, who chatted cheerfully about her plans for Thanksgiving while Barbara watched Atlanta pass by through tinted windows. The familiar city looked different through the lens of escape, less like home and more like a beautiful prison she was finally leaving behind. "Flying somewhere nice?" Rose asked as they pulled up to the airport departure terminal. "Somewhere. I can breathe," Barbara replied, surprised by her own honesty. At the airport, surrounded by travelers heading to family gatherings and holiday celebrations, Barbara felt like she was swimming upstream against the current of expectation. Everyone else was going toward obligation. She was fleeing from it, with the desperate energy of someone who'd finally recognized the difference between love and imprisonment. Security lines moved with holiday efficiency, and Barbara found herself at the gate with 2 hours to spare before her connecting flight. She bought coffee from a vendor who didn't know she was supposed to prefer tea, a newspaper she could read, without wondering if it met with family approval, and settled into an uncomfortable airport chair that somehow felt more like home than the mansion she'd left behind. Her phone buzzed constantly. Texts from Deborah about last-minute details, calls from caterers she'd never hired, reminders about appointments that no longer mattered. She turned it off and dropped it into her purse like discarding chains she'd finally learned to unlock. Meanwhile, at Magnolia Grove, Deborah arrived at precisely 11 o'clock, expecting to supervise final preparations for the family's most important gathering in years. She let herself in with the key she'd never returned, calling out cheerful directions to the daughter-in-law she expected to find deep in culinary chaos. "Barbara, darling, I brought the good silver from storage, and we need to discuss the seating arrangements one final time." Her voice echoed through empty rooms that should have been filled with the chaos of feast preparation. The kitchen stood pristine and unused, morning light streaming across granite countertops that should have been covered with ingredients and equipment. The turkeys sat in their expensive packaging, untouched and accusatory. Deborah found the note 20 minutes later, after searching the house with increasing panic and calling Barbara's name through rooms that answered with silence. She read it 3 times before its meaning penetrated her carefully constructed understanding of how the world worked. Her first call was to Weston, who was in the middle of a crucial merger meeting, when his assistant interrupted with the news that his mother needed to speak with him immediately about a family emergency. "She's gone," Deborah said without preamble when he picked up. "Barbara, she's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" Weston asked, his voice carrying the confusion of someone whose world had just tilted off its axis. "I mean, she's not here. The house is empty, the food isn't started, and there's a note." Deborah's voice carried the kind of shock reserved for natural disasters and other impossible events. Weston left the meeting immediately, racing through Atlanta traffic with his heart hammering against his ribs. The note, when he finally read it, felt like a foreign language composed of familiar words that somehow didn't make sense in the order Barbara had arranged them. "I don't understand," he said, sinking onto one of their kitchen stools while staring at his wedding ring beside her note like evidence from a crime he couldn't comprehend. "We're happy. She loves me. She wouldn't just leave." "Clearly, we underestimated her selfishness," Deborah replied, her shock crystallizing into anger that felt more comfortable than confusion. "To abandon family obligations, to humiliate us in front of 42 relatives, to destroy Edmund's birthday celebration, this is behavior I never would have expected from someone who claimed to love you." But Weston wasn't listening to his mother's analysis. He was remembering fragments: Barbara's exhaustion that had seemed constant lately, her increasing withdrawal from conversations, the way she'd been losing weight and sleeping poorly. Signs he'd dismissed as temporary stress, problems that would resolve themselves after Thanksgiving passed. His phone showed 17 missed calls and twice as many text messages. By noon, news of Barbara's disappearance had spread through the family network with the efficiency of wildfire. Relatives called with questions, concerns, and barely disguised curiosity about the scandal that had erupted in their perfectly ordered world. "What do we tell people?" Deborah asked, pacing their kitchen like a general whose battle plans had suddenly become obsolete. "We tell them the truth," Weston said quietly, though he wasn't sure he understood what the truth actually was. "The truth?" Deborah's voice rose with incredulity. "The truth is that your wife abandoned her family responsibilities at the worst possible moment for purely selfish reasons. The truth is that she's embarrassed all of us in front of people who matter. The truth is that she's proven she was never worthy of the Bennett name in the first place." But 6,000 miles above the Pacific, Barbara was discovering a different truth entirely. As the airplane carried her away from everything familiar, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: space to breathe. The cramped airline seat felt more comfortable than the spacious rooms of her mansion because it belonged to her journey rather than someone else's expectations. She'd brought one book, a collection of Maya Angelou's poetry that had sustained her through college and early career challenges. Opening it felt like greeting an old friend who'd known her before she became someone else's project for improvement. "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you," she read. And for the first time in months, Barbara felt the possibility of telling her own story instead of performing someone else's script. The flight attendant offered her champagne, and Barbara accepted with the simple pleasure of making a choice because she wanted to, not because it was expected or appropriate or aligned with family preferences. The bubbles tasted like freedom and possibility and the revolutionary idea that her happiness might actually matter. As the plane crossed into Hawaiian airspace, Barbara looked out the window at islands that rose from endless blue water like dreams made manifest. Somewhere below, her phone was buzzing with messages from a life that felt increasingly distant. But she was flying towards something that felt like home, even though she'd never been there before. In Atlanta, the first family members began arriving for what they expected to be a perfect celebration. Cousin Theodore and his new wife pulled up to Magnolia Grove with flowers and wine, ready to praise Barbara's hostessing skills and enjoy the magical evening they'd been promised. Instead, they found Weston in the kitchen, staring at takeout menus, while Deborah made increasingly frantic calls to caterers who might be able to provide emergency Thanksgiving dinner for 42 people with 4 hours' notice. "I don't understand," Theodore said, setting down the wine bottle with the care reserved for handling potentially explosive materials. "Where's Barbara?" "She had a family emergency," Deborah replied carefully, her version of truth sculpted to minimize scandal while maximizing sympathy for their impossible situation. But explanations became harder with each arriving relative. Uncle Edmund himself appeared at 3 o'clock, expecting to be honored at the family celebration that had been planned for months in his honor. Cousins who'd flown in from Charleston and California and Colorado found themselves in a mansion filled with chaos instead of the elegant hospitality they'd been promised. By 4 o'clock, it became clear that no amount of money or influence could conjure Thanksgiving dinner from nothing on 4 hours' notice. The Bennett family, accustomed to excellence in all things, faced their first public failure in decades, and it was entirely due to one woman's refusal to sacrifice herself for their expectations. "This is a disaster," Deborah whispered to Weston as they watched relatives mill around the kitchen, offering to help with preparations that didn't exist. "How do we recover from this?" But Weston wasn't thinking about recovery. He was thinking about the woman he'd married, brilliant, passionate, full of life, and trying to understand when she'd started to seem so tired, so diminished, so unlike the Barbara who'd captured his heart with her intelligence and fire. Somewhere over the Pacific, Barbara was watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold that no one had ever told her were inappropriate for Bennett wives. She was flying toward an island where she could walk on beaches warmed by ancient sunshine, where she could laugh without checking to see if anyone was watching, and feel something stirring in her chest that she'd almost forgotten existed, the possibility of becoming herself again. The plane descended toward Maui, carrying her toward a future she was finally free to choose. Behind her, an ocean away, the Bennett family was discovering what happened when the woman they'd taken for granted finally decided she was worth more than their approval. The rebellion had begun, and there would be no easy way back from this moment of perfect, terrifying freedom. Chapter 8. Awakening in Paradise. Maui rose from the Pacific like something conjured from dreams and ancient prayers. Its volcanic peaks crowned with clouds that seemed to whisper secrets of transformation. The plane descended through tropical air that tasted of plumeria and possibility, carrying Barbara toward an island that promised nothing except the radical freedom to be exactly who she was. The airport buzzed with the energy of vacation beginnings. Families heading to resorts, couples embarking on romantic getaways, solo travelers seeking adventures that would become treasured memories. Barbara moved through the terminal with the careful steps of someone still amazed by her own courage, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and the intoxicating awareness that every choice from this moment forward would be entirely her own. Her hotel, a simple place with rooms overlooking the ocean, nothing like the luxury resorts Weston would have booked, felt like sanctuary in its unpretentious beauty. Her room opened onto a lanai, where she could hear waves whispering against sand, a sound that seemed to wash away months of accumulated tension with each rhythmic pulse. For the first time in years, Barbara unpacked, without considering anyone else's opinion of her choices. Sundresses in colors that made her feel radiant, comfortable sandals that would carry her wherever her feet wanted to wander, books she'd bought at the airport bookstore simply because their covers caught her eye and their descriptions promised escape into worlds where women were allowed to be complex and contradictory and beautifully imperfect. Her phone, when she finally turned it back on, showed 47 missed calls and more text messages than she could count. But instead of the usual anxiety that accompanied such digital demands, she felt only a distant curiosity about the chaos she'd left behind. The messages could wait. Atlanta could wait. Barbara Kelly Bennett, if she even wanted to keep that name, was finally doing exactly what she wanted to do. She slept for 12 hours straight, her body finally releasing months of tension held in muscles that had forgotten how to relax. When she woke, Hawaiian sunlight streamed through white curtains, and somewhere below her balcony, she could hear the sounds of a world going about its business without requiring her participation or approval. For breakfast, she chose a cafe that faced the water, where she ordered tropical fruit and strong coffee without checking if it was appropriate. wore a bright yellow sundress that Deborah would have deemed too casual for public appearance, and spoke to strangers with the easy enthusiasm she'd learned to suppress at Bennett family gatherings. "First time in Hawaii?" asked the woman at the next table, her local accent wrapping around English words like music. "First time anywhere that feels like myself," Barbara replied, surprising them both with her honesty. The woman, Leilani, whose grandmother had been native Hawaiian and whose own hands bore the calluses of someone who crafted beauty from earth and fire, smiled with recognition that transcended cultural boundaries. "Ah, you are running away or running too?" "Both," Barbara said, then laughed at how perfectly the question captured her situation. They talked for 2 hours, conversation flowing as naturally as trade winds through palm trees. Barbara found herself speaking about dreams she'd buried under obligations, ambitions that had been edited into appropriate shapes, the feeling of losing herself so gradually she hadn't noticed until she was gone. Leilani listened with the attention of someone who understood that healing sometimes required witnesses. "My tutu used to say that sometimes we must become strangers to ourselves before we can remember who we really are," Leilani said, sketching idle patterns in the condensation of her iced tea glass. "Perhaps you are not lost. Perhaps you are just beginning to be found." That afternoon, Leilani took Barbara to a local pottery studio where tourists learned to shape clay with their hands, while locals created art that captured the spirit of their island home. The studio was open to ocean breezes, filled with the earthy scent of wet clay and the quiet concentration of people lost in the ancient joy of creation. "Have you ever worked with clay?" Leilani asked, offering Barbara an apron and gesturing toward a wheel that waited with patient invitation. "Not since college," Barbara replied, but her fingers remembered the feel of clay, responding to pressure and intention, the possibility of creating rather than simply executing other people's visions. The first touch of clay against her palms felt like coming home. Earth and water combined in her hands, responding to pressure that was firm but gentle, guided by instinct rather than expectation. She shaped not with any particular goal in mind, but with the pure joy of making something that hadn't existed moments before. "You work like someone who has been holding her breath for a long time," Leilani observed, watching Barbara lose herself in the rhythm of creation. Hours passed unnoticed. When Barbara finally stepped back from her wheel, she saw something she hadn't created in months. Beauty that emerged from her own vision, unedited by other people's standards or expectations. The vessel wasn't sophisticated or technically perfect, but it was entirely, authentically hers, curved like cupped hands, ready to hold whatever life might pour into them. That evening, she sat at a beachside restaurant carved into volcanic rock, eating fresh fish and watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that existed nowhere else on Earth. Other diners chatted in languages she couldn't understand, but she felt part of the human symphony rather than isolated by difference. This was what belonging felt like when it wasn't conditional on performance. Her phone buzzed with another call from Weston. She let it go to voicemail, but found herself curious about his message. When she finally listened, his voice sounded hollow with confusion and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "Barbara, I don't know where you are, but I need you to know that I'm starting to realize. God, I've been such an idiot. Please call me. Please come home. I love you, and I think I'm finally beginning to understand what I've been asking you to give up. Just please call me." The pain in his voice moved her, but not enough to make her reach for the phone. Love, she was learning, wasn't enough if it required her disappearance as the price of admission. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, Weston was experiencing his own awakening of sorts. The Thanksgiving disaster had forced him to confront truths he'd been too distracted to see. With Barbara gone, he'd taken time off from the merger that had consumed his attention for months, leaving him space to recognize how completely his wife had been subsumed into family expectations. He spent hours in their house, seeing it with new eyes. Barbara's personal touches had been gradually replaced by items Deborah deemed more appropriate. Her vibrant artwork had given way to neutral pieces that matched the decor. Her books, novels and poetry and business, biographies that revealed her complex inner life, had been relegated to less visible shelves to make room for coffee table books about gardening and entertaining. Even her closet told the story of systematic editing. The bright colors and bold patterns that had caught his attention when they first met had been largely replaced by the conservative palette of appropriate Bennett wife attire. Looking at the progression of her wardrobe over their marriage felt like watching someone fade away in slow motion. "She tried to tell me," he said to himself, remembering fragments of conversations he'd dismissed as temporary adjustment stress. Her exhaustion that he'd attributed to taking on too much too fast. Her increasing quietness that he'd interpreted as growing sophistication rather than suppression. Her questions about his mother's expectations that he'd answered with reassurances instead of recognition. The family, meanwhile, was experiencing their own reckoning. Cousin Theodore's new wife, young, outspoken, unburdened by years of Bennett. Family conditioning had been asking uncomfortable questions about Barbara's disappearance. "I don't understand," she'd said to Evangeline during the chaotic aftermath of Thanksgiving. "Why would planning one dinner be so stressful that someone would leave the country? Couldn't you all have helped?" Evangeline's attempt to explain family traditions and the importance of individual responsibility had sounded hollow, even to her own ears when spoken aloud to someone outside their system. "You mean she was supposed to cook for 42 people by herself?" Theodore's wife had pressed. "While working full-time? With no professional help? That's not tradition. That's hazing." The word hung in the air like an accusation none of them wanted to examine too closely. Back in Maui, Barbara's days began taking on a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Mornings at the pottery studio, where she worked with clay that responded to her touch without judgment or correction. Afternoons exploring the island, walking ancient paths worn smooth by centuries of people living their own lives. Swimming in waters that held no expectations beyond the simple pleasure of floating and being held by something larger than herself. She bought clothes in colors that made her happy rather than colors that were appropriate. She ate meals based on appetite rather than social obligation. She spoke to strangers about books she loved, places she wanted to see, dreams that had nothing to do with proving her worthiness to anyone. On her fourth day, while shaping clay into forms that pleased her eye, she realized she hadn't checked her phone in 8 hours. The digital leash that had controlled her schedule for months suddenly felt less important than the feel of earth beneath her hands and the sound of waves beyond the studio's open walls. "You look different today," Leilani observed, mixing glazes with the casual skill of someone who'd been creating beauty longer than Barbara had been alive. "I feel like I'm remembering something I'd forgotten," Barbara replied, adding touches of blue to capture the way ocean light played in the curve of her latest creation. "And what is that?" "That I exist without permission." The words surprised her with their truth. For months, she'd been seeking approval for every aspect of her existence: what she wore, what she said, how she spent her time, who she was allowed to be. The constant performance had been so gradual she hadn't recognized it as performance until she stopped doing it. That evening, she finally called Weston, not because she felt obligated, but because she was finally ready to speak from a place of clarity rather than confusion or anger. "Barbara?" His voice carried relief so profound it made her chest ache. "Where are you? Are you okay?" "I'm in Hawaii," she said, sitting on her lanai as stars appeared in the darkening sky. "And I'm better than I've been in months." "Hawaii?" The surprise in his voice was genuine. "Why Hawaii?" "Because it's beautiful and far away, and nobody here knows who." "I'm supposed to be," she replied simply. They talked for an hour. the longest uninterrupted conversation they'd had since their honeymoon. He told her about the family's reaction, his mother's shock, his own growing understanding of what their marriage had become. She told her about Clay and freedom, and the revelation that happiness wasn't selfish if it didn't require someone else's unhappiness. "I've been thinking," Weston said as their conversation wound toward its end, "about what you said in your note. About remembering who you are. I think I need to remember who I am too. The man who fell in love with you fell in love with your fire, your independence, your brilliance. I think I've been letting other people dim that light, and I can't forgive myself for that." "It wasn't just other people," Barbara said gently. "I allowed it to happen. I thought love meant making yourself smaller to fit into someone else's life. Maybe it means making your life bigger to include someone else without losing yourself," he suggested. The conversation ended with tentative hope rather than resolution. Change, they both understood, would require more than good intentions and apologies. It would require fundamental shifts in how they related to family, expectations, and each other. The next morning, Barbara woke to find Leilani setting up her easel on the hotel's garden terrace, painting the sunrise with colors that seemed too vivid to exist in real life, but somehow did. "I thought you might want company for your morning creation," Leilani said with a smile. "Today feels like a day for big visions and bold colors." As Barbara mixed clay and prepared to shape another piece of her healing, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, anticipation for what she might create rather than anxiety about what others might expect. The day stretched ahead full of possibility, and for the first time since her wedding, she was the author of her own story. But even in paradise, she could feel the pull of home and responsibility, the magnetic force of love complicated by history and hope. Soon she would have to decide what came next, but not today. Today belonged to clay and light, and the radical act of being exactly who she was, without apology or explanation. Today, Barbara Kelly was exactly where she needed to be, becoming herself again, one breath at a time. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The message from Deborah arrived on Barbara's phone like a diplomatic missile wrapped in silk. "Darling, I'm in Honolulu. We need to talk. The family is concerned, and this situation has gone on quite long enough. I'll be taking the morning flight to Maui. We'll have lunch and resolve this misunderstanding like civilized people." "Exoxo, Mother Bennett." Barbara stared at the screen while her coffee grew cold in the Hawaiian sunshine. Even from across an ocean, Deborah had managed to transform her escape into a situation that could be resolved through proper management. The presumption that she would simply make herself available for lunch, as if she was still operating within the system of expectations she'd fled, struck her as both predictable and infuriating. Trouble in paradise. Leilani asked, appearing with her own coffee and settling into the chair across from Barbara at their usual cafe table. "My mother-in-law is coming," Barbara said, showing Leilani the message. "She seems to think this is all a misunderstanding that can be cleared up over a nice meal and reasonable conversation." Leilani read the message with the kind of careful attention she usually reserved for studying the way light fell across clay. "Before adding glaze, she speaks to you like you are a child who has misbehaved," Leilani observed, "not like a woman who has made a choice she does not approve of." The accuracy of that assessment hit Barbara like a revelation. Even now, even after she'd literally fled the country to escape the constant micromanagement of her existence, Deborah was approaching her as someone whose autonomy was conditional and revocable rather than fundamental and non-negotiable. "What will you do?" Leilani asked. "I'll meet with her," Barbara said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "But not on her terms. Not as someone who needs to be managed or corrected or brought back into line. As someone who has every right to make choices about her own life. That afternoon, Barbara stood at the small Maui airport, watching the plane from Honolulu navigate the ocean approach. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, not the muted colors and conservative cuts that had become her uniform as a Bennett wife, but a flowing white dress that caught the Hawaiian breeze and made her feel like she could float away if she chose to. Her hair, no longer tamed into the sophisticated styles Deborah preferred, moved freely around her shoulders. She looked, she realized with satisfaction, like herself again. Deborah emerged from the plane like a general surveying conquered territory, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the inter-island flight, her expression carrying the confident displeasure of someone accustomed to having her authority acknowledged without question. She wore cream-colored linen that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and walked with the bearing of someone who expected the world to rearrange itself around her convenience. But when she saw Barbara, really saw her, standing confident and radiant in the Hawaiian sunshine, something flickered across her features. Surprise, perhaps, or the recognition that this was not the diminished woman she'd expected to collect and return to appropriate behavior. "Barbara," Deborah said, her voice carrying the tone of controlled disappointment she'd perfected over decades of managing family crises. "You look different. I look like myself," Barbara replied evenly. "It's been a while." They chose a restaurant perched on cliffs overlooking the ocean, a place where conversation would be impossible to ignore, and the spectacular beauty of the setting would make any attempt at manipulation seem particularly ugly by contrast. The blue and white simplicity of their surroundings stood in sharp contrast to the elaborate staging that characterized most Bennett family interactions. "This is quite dramatic. Even for you," Deborah began once they'd ordered, her words carrying the kind of amused tolerance usually reserved for discussing the quirks of beloved but exasperating children. "Is it dramatic to take a vacation?" Barbara asked mildly. "It's dramatic to abandon your family on the most important holiday of the year, leaving 42 people to fend for themselves because you decided to have some sort of episode." The word episode hung between them like a diagnosis, reducing Barbara's carefully considered choice to flee impossible expectations into a temporary lapse of judgment that could be corrected with proper guidance. "It wasn't an episode," Barbara said, her voice remaining calm while something steel-like solidified in her spine. "It was a decision, a conscious choice to stop sacrificing myself for other people's approval." "Sacrificing yourself." Deborah's perfectly modulated voice rose slightly. "My dear, we offered you everything. A place in one of Atlanta's most prominent families, a lifestyle most women would kill for. The chance to be part of something larger and more meaningful than whatever small ambitions you might have harbored on your own. And all it cost was my identity." "Your identity," Deborah repeated with the kind of dismissive emphasis usually reserved for discussing imaginary ailments. "You speak as if you were someone significant before Weston fell in love with you, as if your little marketing job and your modest apartment represented some sort of achievement we were forcing you to abandon." The condescension in Deborah's voice was like a slap that stung, not because it was painful, but because it was so familiar. How many times had she heard variations of this theme? How many ways had she been told that her life before marriage was insufficient, that her dreams were small, that her sense of self was an obstacle to be overcome rather than a foundation to be honored? "I was someone," Barbara said quietly. "I was someone who knew what she wanted, who trusted her own judgment, who didn't need permission to exist. I built a career from nothing, supported myself, created a life that was mine. That's not small, that's everything. And what is it now? What have you created here?" Deborah gestured toward the restaurant, the island, the life Barbara had been building for herself over the past week. "You've run away from responsibility and created, what? A vacation that will end when your credit cards reach their limits." For a moment, the old Barbara, the one who'd been trained to absorb criticism and convert it into fuel for self-improvement, threatened to surface. But the woman who'd been shaping clay and swimming in ancient waters and remembering what her own laughter sounded like was stronger now. "I've created space to breathe," Barbara replied. "I've remembered what it feels like to make choices based on what I want instead of what's expected. I've discovered that I can be happy without constantly proving I deserve to be." "And what about Weston?" Deborah's voice took on the tone of someone playing her strongest card. "What about the man who loves you, who's been worried sick, who doesn't understand why the woman he married has suddenly decided that marriage requires her to disappear?" The question landed harder than the others because it touched the part of Barbara's heart that still ached with love and longing for her husband. But even that love, she'd learned, wasn't worth the price of her soul. "Weston fell in love with someone who doesn't exist anymore," Barbara said. "Someone who was edited and refined and diminished until she fit your definition of appropriate. If he wants me back, it can't be as your project for improvement. It has to be as myself, messy, complicated, unedited, real. And you think that's what he actually wants?" Deborah asked, her voice carrying the kind of gentle cruelty masquerading as wisdom. "Men say they want independent women, dear, but what they really want is women who make them feel important, needed, central to their universe. Weston needs a wife who supports his success, not one who competes with it. Then he married the wrong woman." The words came out with such quiet certainty that both women sat in stunned silence for a moment. Around them, the restaurant hummed with conversation in languages Barbara didn't understand, but somehow felt more connected to than the coded communication that passed for dialogue in Bennett family gatherings. "I see," Deborah said finally, her voice carrying the frost of someone whose authority had been directly challenged. "So this is how it ends. You destroy a marriage, embarrass a family, abandon every obligation and commitment you've made, all because you've decided that your feelings matter more than everyone else's?" "My feelings matter as much as everyone else's," Barbara corrected. "That's what I've learned here. That my happiness, my dreams, my sense of self, they matter. Not more than other people's, but not less either. And any relationship that requires me to pretend otherwise isn't worth preserving." Just then, a familiar voice cut through the restaurant's ambient noise. "Barbara?" She turned to see Weston approaching their table, his clothes wrinkled from travel, his face carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from racing across continents to reach someone you're afraid you might have already lost. He looked older than when she'd left Atlanta, worn down by revelation and regret. "You came," she said, her voice carrying surprise and something that might have been hope. "I had to," he replied, his eyes searching her face as if memorizing features he was afraid he'd forgotten. "I had to see if there was any way to fix what I've broken." Deborah's presence seemed to shrink the space between them, turning what should have been an intimate reunion into a family drama with an audience. The three of them sat at the restaurant like actors in a play where everyone knew their lines, except no one agreed on what story they were telling. Weston, a darling, Deborah began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "No, Mom," he said, his voice carrying new authority. "I need to talk to my wife, alone." The dismissal was gentle but absolute, and for the first time in Barbara's experience, Deborah found herself without a ready response. She gathered her purse with the dignity of someone whose strategic retreat was actually a victory, and rose from the table with imperial grace. "I'll be at the hotel when you're ready to discuss realistic solutions to this situation," she said. Her words directed at both of them, but clearly intended for Weston. After she left, the space between Barbara and Weston felt simultaneously intimate and vast, charged with everything they'd said and failed to say over months of increasing distance. "You look," he began, then stopped, seeming to search for words that could capture the transformation he was seeing. "Like myself," she finished for him. "I know, it's been a while." "I've been thinking," he said, reaching across the table to touch her hand with fingers that trembled slightly, "about everything you said, everything I didn't hear, everything I let happen. And I think I understand now why you had to leave. Do you? You weren't running away from me," he said slowly, as if testing the words. "You were running toward yourself, toward the woman I fell in love with, but then let other people convince me needed changing." The accuracy of his understanding brought tears to her eyes, but also a wariness born of too many disappointments disguised as breakthrough moments. "Understanding and changing are different things," she said carefully. "I know," he replied, "but I want to try. I want to learn how to love you without trying to improve you. I want to remember what it felt like when your independence was one of the things I admired most about you, instead of something that needed managing." They talked as the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in colors that had no names in any language, but spoke directly to the heart. He told her about the week since she'd left, how her absence had forced him to see their marriage through her eyes, how the family's reaction had revealed assumptions about women and autonomy that he'd never questioned, how much he missed not just her presence, but the person she'd been when they first met. She told him about Clay and freedom and the revelation that she could be happy without constantly earning the right to exist, about the difference between love that expanded her and love that diminished her, about the future she wanted to build, not as an escape from their marriage, but as a foundation for something better than what they'd had. "I want to come home," she said finally, "but not to the life I left. I want to come home to a life we build together, where my dreams matter as much as family expectations, where I'm your partner instead of your project." "What would that look like?" he asked. "It would look like choosing each other every day instead of just accepting that we're stuck with each other. It would look like setting boundaries with your family about what they get to expect from us. It would look like me having a career and interests and friendships that don't require your mother's approval. And if she can't accept that?" Barbara looked out over water that stretched toward infinite horizons, toward possibilities that existed beyond the reach of anyone's disapproval. "Then she'll have to choose between having us in her life on our terms or not having us in her life at all," she said. "But either way, I'm done disappearing for other people's comfort." As if summoned by their conversation, Deborah appeared on the restaurant's terrace, her expression carrying the determined optimism of someone who'd spent the intervening hours planning her approach to bringing two wayward children back into line. "I hope you've both come to your senses," she said, settling back into her chair with the confidence of someone whose authority had never been successfully challenged. "This has been a valuable learning experience, but it's time to return to reality. Weston, your business is suffering from your absence. And Barbara, there are several family obligations that require immediate attention." The presumption in her voice that their private conversation had been mere preliminary to returning to her management crystallized something in Barbara's chest. "No," she said simply. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no. I'm not returning to reality. I'm staying in it. This is reality. Me being happy, making my own choices, existing without your permission or approval. That's reality." "Barbara," Deborah's voice carried the warning tone of someone whose patience was approaching its limits. "I'm not finished," Barbara continued, her voice steady and clear as morning light on water. "I'm done being managed and corrected and improved. I'm done making myself smaller to fit into your idea of appropriate. I'm done accepting criticism disguised as concern and control disguised as tradition. You're being ridiculous. I'm being honest. For the first time in our relationship, I'm being completely honest about who I am and what I want and what I'm willing to accept." Barbara stood, her white dress catching the evening breeze, like sails filling with wind. "I love your son. I want to build a life with him. But that life will be ours to design, not yours to dictate." The confrontation that had been building for months finally erupted into the open, no longer hidden behind polite euphemisms and indirect communication. Deborah's fury, when it finally emerged, was magnificent in its scope. Decades of assumed authority challenged by a woman who'd finally learned to value her own opinion as much as everyone else's. But for the first time, Barbara met that fury without flinching, without apologizing, without trying to manage other people's emotions at the expense of her own truth. The reckoning had arrived, and she was finally ready for it. Chapter 10. Coming Home to Herself. 3 months later, Barbara stood in the kitchen of their new home in Barcelona, watching the Mediterranean sunrise paint their terrace in shades of gold and possibility. The apartment belonged entirely to them, chosen together, filled with light and the sound of her own voice speaking Spanish with improving confidence. Their marriage had required complete reconstruction from a foundation of mutual respect rather than complementary expectations. They'd returned to Atlanta together after Hawaii, but not to resume their old life. Instead, they'd spent months dismantling the elaborate performance their marriage had become and discovering what remained when they stripped away everything imposed from outside. The conversation with Deborah had been the most difficult. The ultimatum came with surgical precision: conform to family expectations or face gradual exile from the Bennett Empire. "My wife's happiness isn't temporary rebellion, Mom," Weston had replied with finality that surprised them all. "It's permanent priority." Barbara had started her own consulting firm, specializing in digital marketing for small businesses. Weston restructured his relationship with the family business, establishing clear boundaries. The European expansion provided perfect justification for relocating to Barcelona, where they could build their life according to their own vision. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling beside her on their terrace with his morning coffee. "I regret that it took me so long to find my voice," she said finally. "But the rest? The fighting, the leaving, the starting over. Those weren't mistakes. They were the most important things I've ever done." That evening, they attended a neighborhood festival celebrating autumn harvest. Barbara wore a dress that would have horrified Deborah, flowing fabric in sunset colors, shoes chosen for dancing rather than propriety. She spoke Spanish with enthusiastic imperfection, laughed without checking the volume, and danced with her husband under string lights. "Do you think she'll ever forgive us?" Weston asked during a quiet moment. "Your mother? I think forgiveness requires understanding, and I don't think she understands yet what we've chosen or why." Barbara looked up at stars visible despite the city lights. "But we can't wait for her approval to live our lives." Later that night, Barbara's phone buzzed with a text from Evangeline Ross. "Saw your Barcelona photos on social media. You look radiant. Serafina and I have been talking about taking art classes. Would you recommend it?" Barbara smiled, recognizing the careful language of someone testing the waters of her own rebellion. She typed back, "Art saved my life. So did remembering that I had the right to save it. Call me if you want to talk." The response came immediately. "I would like that very much." Perhaps some of the other wives would discover, as Barbara had, that love was only worth having if it didn't require erasure as the price of admission. A year later, Barbara stood in her first solo art exhibition in a gallery tucked into Barcelona's Gothic quarter. Her paintings lined white walls like windows into different ways of seeing, water and light, and freedom captured in brushstrokes that spoke of journey rather than destination. Weston moved through the crowd with quiet pride, introducing himself as Barbara's husband rather than the other way around, supporting her moment in the spotlight rather than eclipsing it. Near the gallery's entrance, a new painting caught the evening light, a woman in flight, arms outstretched, hair streaming behind her as she soared over infinite horizons. Barbara had titled it Thanksgiving, though it depicted no turkeys or autumn leaves, only the image of someone who'd finally learned the difference between gratitude and sacrifice. "No regrets," Weston asked, the question that had become their touchstone. Only that it took me so long to learn that the most rebellious thing a woman can do is refuse to disappear for other people's comfort, she replied, and Barbara. Kelly Bennett walked into that night knowing she'd finally answered the question that had haunted her since her wedding day. What did it mean to belong to someone without losing yourself? It meant choosing each other daily while remaining whole individuals. It meant supporting each other's dreams instead of editing them for appropriateness. It meant building love on a foundation of mutual respect rather than complementary expectations. Most importantly, it meant remembering that the greatest love story ever told wasn't about two people becoming one, but about two whole people choosing to share their completeness with each other. Barbara had finally come home, not to a place, but to herself.